Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream face-to-face podcast. Today I'm joined by Jack Bull, Derek Lambert from Myth Vision, and Professor Dennis MacDonald. And today we're going to be discussing the Gospel's use of Homer again, as we usually do when Dennis is around. But we're also going to be focusing on Jack. Jack has been somewhat persuaded that the Gospels made use of the Homeric Epics. So really, that's uh, it's fascinating because Jack is a Roman Catholic, and he says a lot of things too that has a and we were just talking about that just before we went on air about you've upset some people on Twitter. We talked about that before, that they don't understand that despite that you are Catholic, that you are also open-minded, and they can't seem to understand that for some reason, and they were throwing some hate at you on Twitter. But setting that aside, Jack, could you
You
tell
mean
us
Twitter has hate on it? No.
Big reveals on History Valley podcast.
you know, but Jack, please elaborate. What persuaded you of Dennis's arguments? Like, how
Jacob, could I interrupt just for a moment?
Sure.
I feel self-conscious about being the center of attention with four people whom I respect a great deal. And in the conversation we had earlier, Jack was talking about his research on Marcion. And so I really would hope that we have a level playing field, that we're talking among intellectuals with each other. We all have questions. We're going to differ on certain issues, but
Right.
I don't want to upstage what Jack's contribution can make. So I'm happy to hear what he says about mimesis, of course, including criticisms or misgivings. But I also want to make sure that we turn the corner and let him talk about Marcion, because that actually is one of the hot buttons in the field right now.
Well,
Absolutely.
First of all, Dennis, thank you so much. I mean, they're really kind words, and actually, I feel greatly that it's me that should be thanking you for appearing with a nobody in the field, relatively speaking. But hopefully, in the coming years, that might change. It's interesting because I became aware of your work about 11 months ago. You did a few videos on Derek's channel, and they sort of, in my periphery, I was aware of them, but I didn't have a lot of time to focus on them because I was just finishing my PhD. Which is on the Ignatian epistles, which obviously very different. So I don't have a lot of time for wider reading at that point. Footnotes rather consume most of your life. And I then, since I finished, sort of went back through some of your videos that you did with Derek and on the History Valley podcast. And I was struck by the fact that this was not more common knowledge or had not been pursued more in scholarship. And on one level, and this plays into slightly what we talked about, the hate comments that you and I both get for different reasons. I suppose one of the reasons that our previous colleagues didn't research it is because they were Anglican, or conservative Protestantism of some form. And this poses a threat in their mind sometimes, that if you were to undermine the origins of the New Testament, then you might undermine the whole story and all the blocks come falling down. But to my mind, I then couldn't understand why more critical scholars in a secular world hadn't pursued it. And even more so, why they then not only just didn't pursue it, but when it was brought to their attention, actively poo-pooed it, as if you were talking nonsense.
Right.
And so I assumed that you were talking nonsense. I have to be honest. That was my starting position. And that's a good starting position to start with any hypothesis or theory.
That's right. Exactly.
Right? Until you started reading, and I've got the two here. The first one was about was from Luke 8:36 and Mark 5:1 about the demon and the casting out of the demon, and the second one was the feeding the 5,000 in Luke 9 and Mark 6. And as you were reading these texts in parallel, it hit me quite hard, and I thought, well, I wonder if he's manipulated the English translation here. I wonder if he's played around with the Greek terms so that he can make it seem like this is the case. So I went back into Homer, I went back into the New Testament, and thought, oh no, he hasn't. That's not what's happened at all, which then naturally led me to read your books. And in there, it becomes fundamentally apparent to me that just on the basis of you have a load of select examples where this is the case, your argument must be given some attention. That was the first point. The thing that really put me onto your work is that there was so many examples that they must at least be. The second, and this was probably the factor for me, is the idea of the idea that we engage with our culture no matter where we are. And so if we think for a second, and I don't like calling them Mark, but let's just assume there was one author of Mark for a second, that this man had no concept of the world around him, was writing in a that is the only way as a someone who's scared of the outside that they could write without some form of cultural bias, without some form of trying to use what was around them to explain what happened. It's so true today that we do this all of the time. Is that you look about all the redemptive narratives in films like Harry Potter, or I think about particularly about The Matrix, they are always trying to use things around them to inform what their new creation is about. And when I realized that it probably wasn't the case that the authors of the four Gospels lived completely alone in their houses without talking to anyone in the history of the world, there must at least be some chance that they knew Homer. When you then doubled down and made it clear that Homer wasn't just known, but taught from day one and idolized as the exemplar of literary technique and storytelling, well, then that changes it all the more. And actually, I can completely see then, and this was adding it onto myself, is that if Homer's Odyssey was the text by which all others were going to be judged, and that Odysseus was the man about town, the greatest hero we could think of, to pitch Jesus against him and say, well, Odysseus did X, but Jesus not only did X, but did Y as well. I think particularly about the calming of the storm narrative, where Odysseus is sort of semi-passive in that, but in Jesus' story, he's active and just takes complete command. That to me, as a first century Greek or a second century Greek, or even just anyone at the time, I would have got that reference straight away. I said, wow, this Jesus dude, he is so much more impressive than Odysseus. Like, Odysseus is an idiot. And everyone would have understood that, right? And that's exciting. And as a Christian now, again, I'd like to, I explained to my young people when I was at a youth club once that how much better at football that Jesus might have been than Messi. Now, he probably wasn't, but he might have had 2 left feet. But you see what I mean? Is that the kids react to that straight away. They got it.
That's right.
And I think the same is true for you and Homer.
Can I highlight something, Dennis, you put in your book? I'm sharing the screen. I don't know if you could pop this up. This is in his synopses of epic tragedy in the gospel. I love this because this manual, this book is such a tool guide. It's not your typical book. It's something you're going to always go back to over and over. When you go through your mimesis criticism, I want to highlight something Jack just said, right? You talk about, it's worth noting, so in any case, it's worth noting that he interpreted the accounts of such exorcisms as lies, unworthy of credibility, despite the credulity of a Platonic philosopher. One might almost say that his poems, we're talking about Homer, are our baby clothes, and we nourish our minds by draughts of his milk. He stands at our side as we each grow up and shares our youth as we gradually come to manhood. When we are mature, his presence within us is at its prime. And even in old age, we never weary of him. When we stop, we thirst to begin him again. In a word, the only end of Homer for human beings is the end of life. End quote. And that's your criterion 1. I don't know which philosopher said that.
I think it's Pseudo-Heraclitus, but let me go back to something that Jack said. You really are drinking the Kool-Aid, my friend. You really understand what's going on. And one of the things that I'm so happy about is that even though I'm an atheist, I'm not against religion. I'm just against ignorance. And I'm a humanist and I'm doing my scholarship. And I would hope that scholarship has traction for Muslims, for Jews, for Christians of all types. And why I don't understand why either the academy or religion needs to feel threatened by this. Unless you're, an ancient pagan and you think, no, Jesus isn't better than Odysseus, everybody should be okay with this. And one of the I'm working on a book on Q, and I think that I don't want to introduce Q now, except to say two things. One is I'm convinced there was a historical Jesus, and you can't simply mythologize Jesus away from the Gospels. And some of the examples are so stronger than others. So it's possible that you have a kind of gray area between the shape of the tradition these authors knew about Jesus and how they mythologize. The other is that so that's one piece of it. I guess I forgot the other piece, but I'm not trying to say that Jesus doesn't exist, and I'm not trying to have people change religion. I'm trying to say we've been misunderstanding these texts because we haven't appropriately contextualized them. Now, when you recontextualize them, then they make more sense. So recently, I found the three Muslims that have a kind of a robust podcast presence, a YouTube presence, had an interview with me, and the comments were almost universally positive. Not because they thought I was sticking it in the eye of Christians, is in favor of Islam, but rather they had a different kind of appreciation for why early Christians would have mythologized Jesus in this way, in a way that Muhammad was never mythologized. And so that the traditions about Muhammad, such as we find later in the Quran, are somewhat more similar to what one would find in the Q document of a Jewish teacher who's out in Palestine. But I guess what I want to say is, Jack, I so appreciate someone who is an affirming Catholic to understand that there can be a hermeneutical payoff in recalculating how early Christian texts were formed.
Yeah, and as you say, right, the only person who could be annoyed about this is a pagan who believes in that those Greek myths are truly brilliant and they're better
That's
than
right.
Jesus.
Yeah.
They're the only
Right.
people that can really be offended here. And I do think and we'll come on to this in a second, I do want to come on to Q as well. That's one of my favorites. But one of the things about this, though, and this is where that I'd like to raise with you some of my concerns, is that I do think, as Morna Hooker says, that we have to be careful of parallelomania. I like the word that she coins there, is that we see maybe 2 or 3 words and therefore we take the whole lot and say this is a parallel. And I've been criticizing that sort of approach a lot with my dating of the Gospels and their use in the Apostolic Fathers. So this idea that in Ignatius of Antioch, for example, we'll find 2 or 3 words that are also found in Paul and then say undeniable, irrefutable evidence, Ignatius knows Paul. And then what you find is in the very next sentence, he contradicts any of the thoughts that Paul was trying to make in that quoted passage. So he clearly either isn't aware of Paul or is purposely contradicting him. In a similar sense, I think the 2 examples that I mentioned of the feeding of the 5,000 and the demon, they are 2 clear-cut examples for me where this is the case. And there are some others where I am more skeptical and I think are perhaps more of a stretch to push. But the point of that is to say that we are still left in the same place. One example is enough examples to say this was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And even
Jack,
if go on,
please.
Well, I was going to say, even if all of scholarship could agree that, let's say, the one example of the feeding the 5,000 in Luke 9 or Mark 6 is that, well, then we can argue about the rest of it. But the point that I want to get across is that we have to begin with the fact, and it is a fact to my mind, that this is happening, and it makes sense that it's happening. It'd be more ridiculous to say otherwise.
The image that I use is the Rocky Mountains when you view them from Denver. And I don't know if you've ever been in the United States and in Colorado and so on, but one can imagine viewing a mountain range from a distance. And the mountains that are closest to you are clear. But then as you look back into the horizon, you see peaks, but they also become fainter. And at the distance, you can't tell if they're there or not. So what I'm trying to show is that there's a mountain range, and that the vision of the farther peaks is going to be fainter. But we know that there's a mountain range there, so let's explore those mountains. By the way, I agree with you about some of the examples being stronger than others. And I understand myself to be a pioneer, and I hope that other scholars like yourself are going to follow and be the settlers and kind of make sense of the nonsense. But I also want to take exception to Mona Hooker's understanding of what I do. I think there's such a thing as parallelophobia. And I would actually insist that for many ancient readers, they were parallelomaniacs. They were looking for the analogies in their culture by which, with which to compare their own mythologies and their so on. So I think, by the way, the idea of parallelomania, as far as I understand, was Sandmill's contribution to the discourse, and it's very clever. And there, by the way, there is such a thing as parallelomania. And I agree with your comments. That's why I have 7 criteria that I try to apply. And they don't always apply, and sometimes they fail or they can be debated. But what we need is a new taxonomy of ancient mimesis and more rigorous criteria. There's one other criterion I want to add, that is, if we find a text and someone is suggesting a parallel to it, can one find a more plausible parallel? Or can one, in fact, see that there are 2 models at play, a mimetic hybrid? Because we know that that actually was taught in rhetorical education. So we are there. I think you probably would agree with this, Jack. We are still in the shakedown cruise of mimesis criticism.
I would broaden that out. I think we're in the shakedown of New Testament criticism. I think that we have a serious issue in our field in that we have been dominated for too long by a very small, not small-minded in terms of they are stupid, but small-minded in terms of their breadth of knowledge and background. I mean, Parallelmania really speaks to me, like I said, in the New Testament quotes in the Apostolic Fathers. And people have a desperate desire to see that because they want to attest the early Christian texts earlier and earlier. Similarly, as you have found, people want to see Jewish parallels in New Testament canon because that's what suits their narrative. Mm-hmm. And that's fine and lovely. And I have no doubt there are many Jewish parallels that are substantiable, that are well evidenced, and we've seen those for years. But the problem is when you try and break out into new things, and we talked about Marcion before this as well, people are immediately want to come back into themselves and say, well, that's a bit fringe. And no matter what evidence you present them, you get quite a lot of confrontation back.
That's right.
Real quick, Dennis, your AC is on or something is going on. You have a background noise. I don't know if that's possible to get that.
Okay, I'll take care of it. I'll be right back.
I just want to make sure it's perfected. Yes, sir. Jacob, I got a couple things if I can add to the conversation, but I kind of wanted to wait for Dennis to get back, Jack, because this is exciting material.
Oh,
I want him to get in the hype too. So, Jacob, if you want to, I don't know if you want to mention something or say something while Dennis is gone, and then I'll hold it for when he gets back. Or
let me just put this super chat up real quick. Hammond, thank you for your super chat. We are Myth Vision, and you've achieved true gnosis. Oh, thank you, Hammond. Really appreciate it.
Seriously, appreciate it, man. Thank you for the super chat. Thank you for supporting Jacob's channel. He's doing great work here. All right, Dennis, I know it'll turn off in a minute.
My wife just came back from the hospital yesterday and has been cold. So, but the house is warm enough, and I have her permission. So we're all
okay.
set.
Sorry, if you had to keep it on, you could keep it on.
No, we're all set.
First thing I want to do is highlight Dr. Richard C. Miller. You know, I've been working with him, Resurrection, Reception, and Early Christianity, but he said, and these are his quotes verbatim, because he's wrote them to me on Messenger. We're talking about this whole rejection of your work from scholars. He gets agitated. And he says, yes, if we say he is more or less on point with, say, only 25% of his mimetic parallels, and he, Richard puts in quotes, I would say it's closer to 50%, with still much lost on us due to diminished familiarity with the ancient cultural mind, then he has struck absolute gold in terms of his contribution to our field of understanding. ... Of course, once you admit even a few of those instances, the more subtle interplay feels far more compelling. That is, once we know Homer was on the author's table, as it were. And then he goes on, trouble is, I would bet no living apologist, Christian apologist today, has ever sat in, I'm not going to keep going because he's keeping it real. In between me and him, he starts talking guy language, locker talk. So he's like saying that. And the other thing is, we mentioned ancient pagans. I'm with you. But there's modern apologists. They need literal, historical, what's being said is what actually happened. And these literalists, these dogma literalists, like I was 10, 12 years ago, could not accept what you're suggesting because you're bringing artistic flavor to this literature, which I love today. Whereas what I needed was every jot and tittles, what actually happened and what was actually said and what actually occurred. Now, we can't say that some of this didn't happen. I'm just saying, like, there wasn't this flexibility of the author. It needed to be literal about what actually occurred and not artistic, I guess you'd say
License.
freedom. Yeah, license. Yeah.
But I would say to that there's two things. Number one, I don't think that we should aim this criticism at Christians. There are just as many secular scholars who are not paying attention to this and criticizing it unnecessarily so.
True.
The second point is that as a Christian, I do find it that sometimes the way that things are posed can be threatening, even though the material itself is not. And the worst thing is a little knowledge. Nothing more dangerous than a little knowledge. And so if you just not read Dennis's books, but if you listen to a 30-minute conversation and Dennis, you tell us all your examples 30 minutes and I come away at the end of it, I could, as an unread Christian, be easily forgiven for thinking you were just bringing us down, you don't like us, blah, blah, blah. The problem is we need to get people to engage with the scholarship fully, to read the book, to go across the examples, and to look at the parallels. Now, unfortunately, we all know that's not going to happen. It might not even happen among scholars, so we can forget it happening amongst all Christians. Additionally, I would say that we were also once very scared of doing this sort of thing with the Old Testament, particularly with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 following the Reformation. But as we know with someone like Augustine, well, he didn't take it literally at all 1600 years before us. So why is it that we now feel so desperate to take things on in that manner? In the case of the Gospels, the level of threat is higher, because if Jesus doesn't do and isn't who he says he is, that's a big problem. However, it can also be the case that just because something happens historically and is written up differently, i.e. with extra bits, doesn't make the thing untrue. We watch history documentaries all the time, or what are they called, docudramas? Is that what they're called, docudramas?
Yes.
And many of the things happening there did actually happen historically, and then they add things to it because actually the base runtime is not long enough to get the story out. Similarly, again, like I said to Dennis, I, as a Christian, still genuinely believe that Jesus calmed the storm, and I get that's put that aside for a second scholarly. But then, following that example, Mark then said, "Well, Odysseus tried to do something like that once. And was asked what to do in the storm. Let's compare those two and show how much of an idiot Odysseus is, or how useless he is." And I think that is a perfectly tenable position for Christians to hold, although I appreciate there's some theology that needs to go around it.
A few comments. One, in your earlier comments, Jack, you talked about other scholars being smart, but not having a broad enough connection to the literature of the antiquity. I liked the term blinkered, that I think they're blinkered, and what we need to do is to open up the blinkers so that they can see more that's around them. The other is, I would agree with you and then disagree with you, Jack, and not as a matter of argument, but as a way of giving viewers an alternative way of thinking about things. I would agree with you that a literary assessment is not a historical assessment. So if I'm saying, in the case of The Stilling of the Storm, that it has echoes of both Jonah and the Odyssey, that is not saying that Jesus didn't still a storm. So I agree with you that a literary assessment is not identical to a historical assessment. So if one says that you have a literary model, it doesn't mean that the model isn't it. The model may simply have shaped some memory, and that's conceivable. But here's where I would disagree with you, but it's a friendly disagreement. And it's a way of giving viewers an alternative way of viewing it. If one says that the Stilling of the Storm story in Mark is indebted to the Jonah narrative and the Odyssey narrative, what's left? Why should one think that the author is not simply concocting the story in order to promote the narrative of whatever gospel it is? And that's where I would draw the line. Yeah, if you can show me that there's something in this narrative that suggests historical memory, I'll grant that, because again, literary observations are not historical observations. But once one has literary indebtedness that's so thorough, I think it's a leap of faith to say that there's anything beyond the story apart from the story itself. But here's another example. I believe that Jesus was crucified. And I also am sure that the narrative about Jesus's death in Mark is modeled after the death of Hector. So even though it's modeled after the death of Hector, it doesn't say that Jesus wasn't crucified, because we have other kinds of evidence to say that Jesus, in fact, was crucified, especially in the Pauline tradition. So I think what we need to do is to open up the hermeneutics for people who are watching this video, this podcast, to say that it's okay to acknowledge literary imitation of the classics because these authors had something to say about their cultural environment and the cultural capital of Greeks in order to establish their Jesus as a venerable hero. That doesn't mean that he wasn't a hero. So then the issues are thrown back on the reader.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think that in a non-faith world, that is the most reasonable explanation. And I totally agree that just because you use literary devices, it doesn't invalidate the historicity behind the events. And I'm not here to preach apologetics today and explain why why I still think those things happened. I liked your second analogy though, also because that proves the point. And I wonder also in the case of, for example, Paul's shipwrecks, whether they may have been embellished to bring us to a point where they create more of a parallel with the Homeric epics. So yeah, I totally get that point, and I think that again, you mentioned earlier that this is the beginning of a shakedown. It struck me that I was talking to Marcus Vincent, who was my supervisor, and we were discussing some of the work I was doing and the criticism I was getting for it. And I think this is true for your work as well, is that we probably only write for the generation in 100 years' time. And I doubt any of us might ever live to see the idea become mainstream, because you further mentioned that we have to open up the minds of our peers and our colleagues. But the problem is, we're never going to be able to do that unless we're in places and institutions to reform the curriculum to make that happen. Now, I went through a master's in undergrad and a PhD, and I'd never read any Homer, any Virgil, anybody. And that's because I did theology degrees. Now, I get on one level, you can only cover so much in 3 years. But on the flip side, judging from what you've said, they must become core reading. No? I mean,
that's
that has
right.
to be the
Exactly.
case.
That's right. Exactly.
And so, yeah, that's one of the concerns that I have, is that academia is slow in all cases, but without control of the institutions. I don't want to use the word control as if we're going to abuse power, but without control over the curriculum, they're just going to keep on teaching it the same way, because that's the way we go. But as I said to you, the thing that annoys me more here, I get the Christian argument. I get it. I don't get the secular argument.
That's what kills me. I mean, look, Jack, you know a little bit about my channel, I'm sure. You probably know more than a little. I mean, a lot of people have heard of Myth Vision. We're about to be at 100K. I've got a list that's got like 50 PhDs. I've asked several of them about Dennis's works. Most of them, they don't know it. Most of them that do know it reject it. And they'll give reasons. I'm sure some of them are like the rejections we got from the Redditors, who act like Mark could not have been, sophisticated enough, or, his writing proves that he's not an elite, therefore he couldn't know. There's a list of things, right? I see I turned a light bulb on in Jack's brain there. But it's like, I love this guy. I love Dennis. I love him as a person. I love his work. I fell in love when I read Mythologizing Jesus. And at the end of the book, that was where I really fell in love, was when he asked his grandson, which story did you like better, the Greek one or Jesus? And he's like, the Greek one, because it's more like intense and it's almost like Game of Thronesy, right? You're like, ooh, but which one do you want to be like more? Well, I want to be like the Jesus story. And then I had teary eyes at the end of that book, because I was like, this is a whole paradigm change of how we can view this literature. It's no longer, even among believers, right, can be a whole nother angle in which we're perceiving it, opens a whole nother world, but especially in scholarship. I'm like, why is it ignored? Why aren't there more imitation scholarship of like Virgil? Why isn't there more going on with Homer? Why not Euripides? Why not more of it than what we see? It's not mainstream. So anyway, there's my TED Talk.
Yeah, no, you totally burst something into my mind there. One of the things that I almost screamed at the monitor for when you were doing that review of the Redditor was this criticism of Mark. I wrote my master's on Mark, and it bugs me no end, this constant attack on Mark's intelligence, or at least his writing ability. Look, I'm not saying to you that he is as eloquent or as beautifully written as Luke.
Right.
Or even Paul writes, but it's become this thing of a false dichotomy where this Luke good, Mark therefore must be bad, and that's not the case at all with Mark. He's so clever. The Son of Man narratives that draw out from it, the comparisons to Daniel 7, which is what my master's thesis was about, showed me how clever Mark was. And yes, it reads a bit funky so sometimes, with always the immediately and therefore, immediately and then this, but he is not an idiot. He is a master at work. And arguably, if he is the first of the canonical Gospels, which I think we agree on, although I don't think it's the first Gospel, and I hope we come on to this in a minute, he didn't just write a narrative. He wrote, something completely brand new. That sort of literary style, that sort of pioneering, like you, Dennis, he pioneered a new style of writing. And I think that deserves more credit than just, well, he didn't write very good Greek. And usually the people I know that say that don't speak Greek. So I'm not really interested in what they say.
Well, Jack, thank you. I want to develop something that Derek said, and that it was pivoted off of what you said, Jack. The issue isn't just higher education with the inertia of the academy to accept the kinds of things we're interested in doing. One also has the publishing world. One has theological schools. One has churches and denominations, so that my students get turned on to mimesis criticism, and they're terrified to bring that to a board of ordained ministry that they're going to be trying to get ordained by, because there is such inertia and misunderstanding about these things. So one of the things that I so appreciate about Jacob and Derek and the podcasts is that we have to do an end run around the institutions that are protecting certain ways of doing biblical scholarship. And it pains me that we need to do it that way. And by the way, I have suffered by not having the right kind of institutional support for this kind of research. And my students sometimes have trouble getting jobs because they get painted, they get tarred with my brush. So, but I think it's going to change, Jack. I think because of people like you, younger scholars who are going to carry the baton and to change things a bit. So
starts with you, Jack. No pressure.
Well, it was interesting because I think that one of the things that I was struck by, I was listening to your interview with Richard Miller as he talked about SBL, and I have to say I was actually a little bit shocked by some of his comments. I don't necessarily agree with all of what he said by any means, but I do think that America acts as a microcosm, or in some sense a macrocosm because of how big you guys are, in this space that hasn't always translated the same way it does here. And so, for example, I mean, I'm at King's College London for my PhD, and I went to a Catholic university for my undergrad. And none of this, when I brought it up to academics and peers, would be at all sort of, they would say, you're wrong, but none of it would bring me a black mark. I would always be allowed to practice and get on with what I wanted to do. And I find this a lot, again, we mentioned Marcion so many times already, hopefully we do come on to him. We get a lot of this because I think Marcion probably produced the first gospel that we have extant. And this naturally would bring massive issues in America, I'm sure, if I tried to apply for jobs over there. But I've not faced quite the same hassle here. People think I'm wrong, of course, but they don't want to deny me a job or publication in a journal, etc. And so I wonder to what extent, it is limited to your end. Again, in Germany, I've not found quite the same. In Italy, maybe a little bit, but nothing quite as bad as what I see you face, Dennis, whether from other academics or from lay people in inverted commas.
I don't know how to compare it, Jack.
No.
So tell me more about Marcion.
So one of the other reasons I was really interested in your work was I then went through Marcion's gospel to see what remained of those Homeric parallels. And I haven't finished yet, so that remains to be seen. But one of the things that I thought played into our hands rather nicely as Marcion priority people, with people like Mark Bilby and Marcus Vincent, is that this idea of replicating Greeks certainly takes place in the first century. You made that abundantly clear, and I can totally see that's the case, replicating Greek literary concepts. But I think it finds an even bigger home in the second century in so many ways, particularly when you think about Hadrian and the Greekling and what he brought back in terms of Greek culture and the embracing of such things with Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus Pius and such. And alongside with our evidence, I think, which shows Marcion to be the first gospel, that, or at least the earliest gospel we have extant, I think this also rather plays into our hands, that these parallels were then brought in to further the concept of Jesus is better than the Greek legends. Again, one thing that I'm yet to do, and I think it would be interesting to find out, is that if all of these parallels were present in Luke, of which Marcion's gospel is the most similar, but not present in Marcion, we would have an interesting question there as to how did someone do that?
Okay, let me respond to that if I might.
Of course.
But I'm going to start with a question. There are at least 3 different competing reconstructions of Marcion's gospel, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm prone to one that you probably considers the most conservative, that is Dieter Roth. Matthias Klinghardt followed by David Trobisch has another, and Vincent has a somewhat different spin.
Indeed.
So I think it's really, and now this is getting really deep in the woods for the auditors. I know that, and even probably for Jacob and Derek. But it's important to determine which of those reconstructions of Marcion's gospel, because it is like a Q quest. You're trying to tease out of text that we have and allusions to them a text. And I don't want you to go into the criteria that are used for the reconstruction of Marcion's gospel. That would take us way into the woods. But if I were to use, so this is where my position is. If I were to use Diderot's reconstruction, you would have to have mimesis happening both in the if you make Marcion's gospel earlier than canonical gospel, you would have to have two literary moments, both of which are doing Homeric imitation. Now, that's not impossible, but it violates Occam's razor, in my view. So, in my view, unless we have more clarity about what Marcion's gospel actually said, you cannot have, this is my challenge to you, you cannot have mimesis criticism and Marcion's gospel priority.
So, like a good boy, I sat at the feet of my master, Marcus Vincent, and so naturally that's who I predominantly go with. But again, without trying to get into the weeds, I think that before we even need to choose actually which version of Marcion's gospel we'd like to go down, and even if it is the more conservative version, the question about which ordering of the gospels comes first, I think, because whichever Marcion gospel we choose, I think we still present the first extant gospel. That's not to say that none existed prior, but it is to say that in terms of attestations, receptions, this is the earliest one we can show. And in the case of the canonical gospels, we have no evidence of them in the apostolic fathers, really. And the one
that is not true. That is simply not true.
I know Papias is your friend. Yeah, but Papias, I'd argue, to a large extent, rests in the same place as the Marcion question or the Q question, because Adolf von Harnack, if it's true that he did find something of Papias, which we will never know now, I don't think. We don't know entirely what Papias says, except his fragments. We haven't got the text fully that he worked with.
But we have the fragments. We have the fragments, and the fragments are important.
They are important, but to what extent can we extrapolate from them a full gospel? So I think it's perfect.
No, you can't, but you can say that there was something like that. And Papias does not mention Luke or John. He's writing before that. And the three gospels he knows are two attributed to Matthew and one to Mark. So again, maybe we should just let the various positions stand and have people then read our books so they know what we're talking about.
I wish I was lucky enough. I haven't got a book yet, but it's coming. It's coming. It's in the works.
Okay,
it's coming.
Good.
But not on Marcion, I'm afraid. It's on Ignatius.
Yeah.
Jacob, do you have a question for us?
Yeah, I was about to throw this in. And some of the parallels I thought were the most fascinating is I think that you showed some of the parallels, and I think it's in Mark, between Jesus and Achilles, but also the Odysseus story, like calming the storm, and with Jesus calming the storm. Those are some of my favorite parallels. And the Hector thing, you mentioned Hector earlier, that Jesus's death was mythologized based on Hector's story. Like those are some favorites.
Yeah. A segue between what you said and what Jack said is when you do your research, Jack, and by the way, I have written on this topic in Synopses of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels. There's an appendix on the Gospel of Marcion. But when you take a look at it, and you compare them, at least in Roth's edition, the canonical gospel is always closer to the mimesis of Homer than Marcion's gospel. So I would say, by the way, let me also say this. Marcion's gospel is a very important intellectual development in the field, no matter what one's decision is about its antiquity and its relationship to the Gospel of Luke. It's important, and I don't mean to demean it at all. But the major question for the synoptic problem, and I think you'd agree with this, is how does it connect to the synoptics otherwise? And so which of these Gospels, the canonical or a reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel, is most effective in solving the synoptic problem? And there, at this point, I suspect we're going to disagree. Derek, do you have a sense of what this discussion's doing? Your sound's
muted,
on.
Derek.
Come on, Derek, you're the professional.
This is a conversation that I'd love to have with you, Jack, just to get your personal point of view on Myth Vision sometime on Marcion, and then maybe even have a specific video where I have Dennis come and talk too. But I think we came into this with two giants, or another analogy is there's too many chiefs, not enough Indians. What I mean is we're dealing with two massive iceberg topics that can overlap, but it might distract us from the positivity that we initially have with the mimesis. So
That's fine.
You are coming from two schools that are going to clash on that. And I think it's best to just kind of highlight at least one thing. And that is what we're seeing is imitation. Getting back to that, just to make a point, Jack, it's really cool to see you open-minded and seeing this. It's not like, you know, someone's sending you a check. Hey, will you just say this and approve of what, you know, you're actually being persuaded by what looks to be imitation.
But if you'd like to, my address is, I'll DM you afterwards. I mean, look, yeah, as you say, right? I'm not anyone's shill, and I didn't know Dennis before this. In fact, I've never met Derek either, so no one's put me up to this. Obviously, I've known Jacob for a while now. But as we mentioned a few times, you know, and I don't want to just repeat ourselves for the hour, but if it is the case that Dennis's theory is true once, and only once, that's still enough. That's still enough to make it a credible field of study. And the methodology is proved true even more so than the outcome in some sense.
I want to ask you some probing questions, Jack, about this. You brought up two examples, the feeding of the 5,000 and the demoniac, which that's my favorite one personally, is the demoniac, because it's like, how do you escape this? I mean, it's just so obvious to me that something's going on. Are those your top two? I mean, you brought those two up. Are those your two favorite you're convinced of?
The demoniac was my favorite.
Okay.
As well, because when you were reading them out side by side with someone else on your channel, and I just shut my eyes like this, and I just listened, and apart from the names that were being dealt with, the story was the same.
Right.
And to a large extent, and this is one of my fears that I think will be a straw man of your argument, Dennis, that I do think that some people have put forward, is that even if there are the Greek terms differ, right? The Greek terms differ slightly. That is so much less relevant than the fact that the stories are the same, right? Just because you tell it with different words. And now, don't get me wrong, when the words are the same as well that only compounds and seeks to further your position. But again, you close your eyes, you replace all the names the opposite way around, and you're left with the same story, give or take some details.
I imagine this is why the Byzantine Chintones, I mean, this is why I think they thought we could get away with using Homer's lines. And I like Richard C. Miller said it really well with me too. He doesn't think it's the minutia, the details of the Greek comparisons and stuff of linguistics that is going to do it, or the side-by-side charts, so to speak. He thinks it's this narrative arch that you're going to read and see. To me, it's things that grab you. Like, this isn't an example we brought up, but Jesus being baptized, he's a son of a God. He's baptized and empowered by a deity that comes down and flies down to him like Athena flies to Telemachus. And Telemachus, though, is doubting who his father is. Jesus, we don't have any words that he's doubting who his father is, but he's reinforced who his father is. So he's not a doubter like Telemachus, but he is told and affirmed, you are my son in whom I'm well pleased. And boom, what happens? He's empowered. He goes and gets tempted in the wilderness. He heads to the people. He starts to tell them, preaching the kingdom of God. And they're going, what the heck got into this guy? Just like Telemachus, right after Athena enforces that strength in him, affirming that he is the son of Odysseus, he runs out to the suitors, and these guys are going, what got into him? Is that really you? So I'm looking at this, and it doesn't need to be, did this word, does this match? Can we find any differences? Was he wearing a hat? Did he have sandals on his feet? I mean, how ridiculous do you have to be to sit there and get that lost in the minutia to forget how this story arch is there?
Yeah, and if I throw you back to 1999, I remember when The Matrix came out, and I was only 5, just to make you all feel a bit old, although me and Jacob are quite young, I think.
I feel old already. I am old.
One of the first things, I wasn't a Christian back then, but one of the things that struck me really hard was that was a bit like the biblical stories that I'd heard. Right? I wasn't a Christian, so I didn't really know them, but there was an element to it. So I was like, hey, this Neo dude's a bit like Jesus. He sort of comes back from the dead. Now, if you can find me any words in the Matrix or any sentences that are similar to the Greek constructs of the canonical Gospels, I'll give you the money myself. But like you say, that is exactly how you would go about writing something, right? That
Jack, I want to comment on what you said and going back to Derek said. And the first is simply an observation with which you'll surely agree. The Greek of the New Testament is a far different language from Homeric Greek. So the fact that you don't have verbal equivalents should not surprise us, because it's the thematic pieces that are more important. And I would give 2 analogies. Then one is Virgil's Aeneid, which is a bit too obvious, but the other is Lucian's satires. Lucian can have satires of Homer. He says he's doing so in the true story, but he never announces that, in fact, these are parodies. And when he writes the parody, there are, I would say, no verbal parallels between them. They all are thematic. They all have to do with characterization, motifs, a function, and so on. So that the notion that mimesis is literary borrowing at the morphological level is nonsense. It's at the semantic level where we see these things happening. It's a narratological similarity.
I mean, getting back to Jack and my favorite story on the demoniac, it's not my favorite story technically in the Bible on its own. It's just my favorite imitational example that I like. And I'm looking at this guy cutting himself in a cave. He's lawless. He's wild. And I know Polyphemus. We know about the Cyclops, who's wild and he's in a cave. You can find hundreds of differences. And you can find several examples. And what I find that happens is people try to find those differences and say, because it's a different narrative and we can see these differences, we can throw it out. If there's that many differences, like in one of them, you have him in tombs, but in another, you have him in an actual cave. Let's say the gospel says he's in tombs and the other one says he's in a cave. Therefore, they're not the same, or they find ways to just make it irrelevant. And I'm looking at it, I'm saying, you've got soldiers, legion, being cast into pigs, and you have Circe, the book after this Cyclops, literally in the Odyssey, turning soldiers into pigs. I don't know thematically if you could get any closer to, if you weren't trying to look like you were plagiarizing, you can't get any closer than that. I can't imagine.
No, and if I may, on the terms thing as well, Dennis, I mean, again, viewers might not know this. So I learned Koine Greek because that's what all biblical Greek students learn. They call it biblical Greek, which is not entirely sure what that term means because it was not exclusive to the Bible, but we are where we are. That's what we learn in school. And so when I got into my master's and started dealing with some other texts that I was interested in, like Homer or Homer's Greek, I couldn't read it. That's the level of the difference that we're dealing with, because they are so drastically different in the way they form their grammatical set, their grammar, their terminology. Everything is so different. And even now, and I've been doing it for some years, I still struggle to read Homer in the original. Right, I still find that really tough. So again, just because you don't find the same words it shouldn't be indicative at all of a lack of attempt at literary
Exactly.
mimesis. Yeah, I think it's really tough. If those of you want to try and learn it, it's tough. Good luck.
It was tough even for ancients, Jack. Schoolboys said, "Why should I learn to read Homer when nobody talks like that?" And so it was a point of annoyance for many a schoolboy.
Yeah, I said the exact same thing about Shakespeare 10 years ago. Did not get it. Did not get it.
Also, a couple of other really good parallels is when Dennis shows the parable of the vineyard coming from the Homeric Epics. The naked man at Gethsemane has a parallel in the Homeric Epics too. And when Jesus dies, and you have the women that go to the tomb, they come out, the weeping women, and there's something like that in the Homeric Epics too. And it's just amazing. All these stories that you think are gospel creativity turn out, no, they're in Homer too.
It's interesting that I love that one. The three women that are they're on the tower watching Hector, die, and they're mourning his death that they just witnessed. And there's three women in Mark that are from a distance. They're mourning the death of Jesus who come to the tomb. But one of those women's name, Mary Magdalene from Tower Town. I mean, you have these three women in the tower in Homer, and then you have Magdalene, this woman who's of Tower Town. What's that about? I mean, it's clever. I think it's awesome. By the way, speaking of which, a lot of these parallels that you're discussing, they get into the weeds. We go into several of these and more in that course. And I just spoke with Dennis earlier on the phone, calling him up. I said, Dennis, I know we put a lot of time, effort, energy in all of this, but I think we should drop the course price $10 and make this something more accessible for more people. Dennis gave the thumbs up. I called the queen. And so you can get the course, 18 lectures on mimesis criticism. And we go through giving visuals through his book, take you through it. I mean, it's a guide. It's one of the best courses I think I've done.
And I recommend his books.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, some of the books are very expensive, especially in Europe. So, but the synopsis, unfortunately, is not easily available in Europe right now, through Amazon. So, but let me, if I might, I don't know, Derek and Jacob, if we're going to have any chats related to this, but I want to tell you, Jack, what I appreciate so much about this conversation. You and I would position ourselves vis-a-vis the Christian tradition in a somewhat different way. But both of us have, as scholars, the task not of opposing religion, but opposing ignorance or being blinkered from the classical influence on early Christian texts. And believers and unbelievers and Jews and Muslims are going to assess those similarities differently. And I think that's a part of the wonderful hermeneutical game that mimesis provides. So going back to the statement that literary judgment is not the same as a theological or historical judgment is really quite important. Mimesis doesn't belong to one way of understanding religion or understanding God. It really has to do with understanding texts. And then the job is to assess what those texts mean for the construction of realities to make sense of our world. And people are going to do that differently. But I really appreciate, Jack, your candor and your scholarship and your openness to some of these examples. And I would hope that you could be a model for other people who are like you.
Well, it's funny you say that. I with that conversation you had with the three brothers, I saw someone tweet that they found him quite belligerent in his apologetics. And one of the things that I responded to that tweet was that, I don't think apologetics necessarily have any place in this conversation that you and I are having, right? That if we're both trying to discern what happened in the New Testament in terms of, like you say, mimesis, it couldn't matter any less whether I'm a Christian or not, as is shown by the fact that most secular scholars disagree with you. So it's clearly not a Christian bias that's the problem. There's another bias at play.
That's right. Yeah, very helpful.
Or if it isn't a bias, it's a lack of awareness. So it's almost like they don't even know. Like you said, you weren't reading Homer, you weren't reading Virgil, they weren't making that demanded reading. And I feel like I have to admit, I do think there's a bias there, but it's like, Jack, you're taught by your teacher and they teach you a certain way and they tell you how to think and what to do. And like, there's a tradition and it's hard. It's almost like Dennis came out of nowhere with this and was really doing this kind of imitation that no one else was doing.
Yeah, but anyone who knows Marcus Vincent, my supervisor, knows that if you told him the sky was blue, he'd tell you it was green. And so he encourages you to read everything, even if it's definitely wrong. So I couldn't stay away from Dennis for that reason. And then I became convinced.
Oh, thank you so much.
Not that Marcus thought you were wrong, but then I read it and say, well, actually, yeah. I mean, here we are. And I think, look, you mentioned the situation with being taught and the biases. I do think there is an underlying bias. I was talking to someone the other day about the Ignatian question, of which, if I'm right, then I disprove basically 40 years of his scholarship completely wrong. And that comes with a weight to it, even if you haven't got a faith attachment to it. If you've worked 40 years under this illusion, and then it's wrong, that hurts.
That hurts.
Now, luckily, I haven't done any work on disproving Homeric influence in the gospel, so I haven't got a horse in this race yet. But I'm sure if I had, I'd find that quite difficult too.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that, Jack. That's exactly what Dennis has been saying since we met, that they would have to change. And scholarship doesn't want to say, Dennis turned us on our heads, we all need to change. They want to ignore him rather than actually bring him to the table. And since you've retired, you haven't even had any speaking engagements that, like, several people who retire get called back or are told to come speak. Is that changing for you, Dennis, at all?
No, it isn't. And in fact, the only speaking engagement I had was a setup with Michael Licona because they wanted him to, dismiss my arguments. And it was set up in such a way that it really favored his position. But I have not been invited to a church, to a university, to a seminary. I do now have an invitation to SNTS to give a seminar presentation on the Acts of the Apostles and Virgil. So I'll be going to Vienna in a couple of months to give a paper there. But that's the only invitation. And by the way, I haven't been invited to be involved at the Society of Biblical Literature or SNTS earlier. So this is the first opportunity I've had. But I also know that when I go to Vienna, Stefan Krauta is going to be there, and he's a major critic of my work on the Acts of the Apostles. So it's going to be another wrestling match, I think. But it's been a surprise to me. And I thought it was related to COVID, that, everybody had fewer speaking opportunities for a couple of years there. But mine is entirely dried up.
Sorry about that. We're trying to change that as much as we can.
You're doing great.
Well,
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I've only faced I gave a paper last year at the BNTS, the British New Testament Society conference, and I think if they had a tomato, they might have thrown it. But when I got to the end of the paper, they were very nice personally, but just not impressed with my paper. And again, I asked them for criticism, and I didn't get a lot. I got a lot of silence, which is actually a good sign, I should think. But naturally, that's the way it goes
But
sometimes.
you can't argue against silence. You can argue against an opponent, but you can't argue against silence.
That's true. But like I say, I mean, eventually you're writing for 100 years' time. That's just the way it is.
And
and that's no fun while you're alive, but it is. Hopefully you get a legacy. I mean,
That's why I'm trying to use my platform as much as I can to get more people interested and kind of cheering from them on the streets, crowds. Saul killed his thousands, but Dennis killed his tens of thousands. You know what I mean?
No, don't do that. No. I'm not trying to kill anybody.
I'm teasing,
Yeah.
But it's funny. I'm writing a book at the moment about William Cureton, who was a wonderful, wonderful Orientalist in the 1800s, and his theory, so many of his theories were absolutely stamped upon, whether it be about Hebrew Matthew or the three-letter short recension of Ignatius, and he was stomped and just completely forgotten. And now I'm writing a book about him. I'm publishing his ideas as if they were brand new. And again, in 100 years' time, if that's our legacy, I won't see it, but I'll take it. At least someone got reaped the harvest
Good for you.
of what was sown. But that goes for you, even more so with this Homer stuff. I really think so.
Let me ask you both this. Dennis has a lot more time with this, but Jack, you might have some perception after just getting into this. If the humanities are slowing down, shutting down, jobs are not, what are the odds that Dennis is? I mean, this is a bit of a pessimistic question, but it's like, what are the odds that the New Testament, any scholarship, is really going to buy Dennis's work without more of the humanities and seeing more of a cross hybridic study of both classical literature and New Testament? Because they're working within this bubble of, well, we need to look for Jewish antecedents. They're not really impressed with Virgil or Homer, or trying to, I'm not going to say they're not even impressed. They probably don't even know it much. Look at Robin Faith Walsh, though. She's turning over a new leaf. She's really bringing in a whole new paradigm for them. And I like the way that she's doing it. It's really starting to make a change. But what are your thoughts about that?
Well, we come at it from two different sides, don't we, Dennis? I mean, I've been trying to get a job for the last couple of years and have failed. I'll be leaving academia at the end of this month probably, and that'll be it for me because there's no jobs. And so when it comes to the traction that Dennis's work can make, my answer is unfortunately probably slim, at least in the short term. We're closing departments here in England, left, right, and centre. I go further. We closed an English department in England. If we're closing English, who on earth stands a chance in theology, biblical studies, and Hebrew Bible and such like?
And the Cambridge Classics department no longer requires an exam in Homer.
I go further. Most universities in the UK don't even require you learn Koine Greek. Most of my peers on my PhD, although not all of them are biblical, I admit, have no formal teaching in Koine Greek. And in fact, 2 years ago, the way they taught Greek and Hebrew, and I could not go over this, they taught it as a dual class where you did 1 hour Hebrew and 1 hour Greek together once a week for 6 months, and that was it. That was your formal training in Hebrew and Greek.
It really means the only thing you can use is a dictionary.
Yeah, literally.
Really?
I mean,
I'm not kidding.
You could probably get through maybe John's prologue if you learnt it off by heart, right? Like that's where you get to. And so in terms of the future of our study, I don't know if we're going to have any at all, never mind looking at Dennis's work. I know on the continent there's a little bit more hope. In Italy, they are starting some more things, and Germany always value this sort of stuff. But certainly speaking from my country, I think we've had our chips.
I think that's right. But I want to say something that I've never said, even to Derek and Jacob in the past. I did not write my books or do my research for the academy or the church. I wrote it for my students because I was given tasks to train students for ministry. And I found that they were so mentally ill-equipped to understand what these texts were doing. And I found them to be so interesting and exciting for myself, given my classical background at Harvard. And so I wanted to enrich them. So I never intended to become a personality on YouTube. And it comes as a shock to me, and especially to my family, that recently I became a cartoon thanks to a YouTuber. So this is all very fresh to me. And so I'm really so grateful for the exposure that these ideas are getting now. And Jack, I appreciate your generous way of understanding them from your own perspective. So I think it's worth contributing to the intellectual climate, whether or not my reputation gets any further than, a few thousand views on YouTube. But I think in the long term, people are not going to be able to ignore the kinds of things that I'm trying to point to. And so I'm really humbled by this discussion and not quite sure what to do with this this new notoriety. But I'm grateful to YouTubers like Jacob and Derek and the three Muslims and others for at least giving some exposure to it and giving people an opportunity to see a new way of viewing these texts.
Well, we're thankful for you, Dennis. And Jack, thank you again. For me, I just want to say thank you. And of course, Jacob, for hosting this. And then I'm sure Jacob might have some super chats, I hope.
There's one more.
Okay. Jack, I just want to thank you for coming in and showing, kind of being an example for somebody who is willing to go on and say, hey, I think there's mimesis here. I still think there might be historical memory, or I'm convinced by faith. It can be even faith, right? It could be like, hey, I have faith that this is true behind, but I can't deny the literary is there. So you're an example. That's why I highlighted the fundamentalist. And I know that this is a problem in academia as well. My problem with academia and the problem that we see with academia and then the problems we see on the internet, I have two worlds that I'm fighting. Mostly what you're seeing is the academic side. I'm most of the time seeing the comments in my YouTube channel 24/7 saying it really happened exactly as it, and it's like they're afraid of the implications of some of this having literary freedom, that the author can maybe be flexible and adjust things that may not be literally as they happened, but as they picture or as they want them to be pictured, whatever it may be. And you're coming at this very mature, as an example, as a Catholic who's saying, I'm taking back my tradition. I'm taking back some of my fathers, even the Byzantine fathers who understood this and rewrote things, the Cintones. You're taking an intellectual route. And that is an example I hope more Christians follow. So.
Well, I want to say one more thing about Jack.
No, that's nothing about me.
Hit the road, Jack. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. Jack, I bleed for you in not being able to get an academic position.
Yeah.
That stinks.
It's really tough.
It's very tough. And let's keep in touch. And if there's something I can do to help you with this, not that you should parade Mimesis criticism, because that's not going to help you get a job.
Publicly, MacDonald, I distance myself from it.
No. I can give you some moral encouragement, and I feel that same way about my students. That the humanities generally are really in a crisis mode right now, and the chances of successfully bridging two now nearly moribund, fields, classics and New Testament scholarship, is tough, and they're going to be victims and people suffering. And I don't want you to be a sacrificial bull, hard to play on your name, right? Okay, but all
The
the
old one's
best
the
to
best.
you. All the best to you.
Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate it.
Let me just put up this super chat real quick. Elias Almodi, thank you for your super chat. Papias did not know our canonical Mark and Matthew. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yes, I do. What Mark and Matthew did he know?
I have an answer to that, but I need to go soon. So but this is a good incentive for you, Derek and Jacob, to have Dennis and I back on to discuss this more fruitfully and fully. I think.
Maybe.
No, I'm just I know other people make that claim, including most recently Bart Ehrman, and I just think it's ridiculous myself. But I'd like to hear your arguments.
Maybe we did set up a formal debate.
Don't
Not to be like, but like really a scholarly, respectful dialogue debate where you formally can present your evidence for and against and or whatever.
May I give due deference though to get Marcus Vincent rather than I on that? It's
well, yeah,
important
I mean, whatever. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Jacob may be interested in hosting that. I'm sure he would be.
I did host a discussion between Marcus and Dennis before about the whether if Marcion's gospel was first or not, and it went pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a debate with Dr. Ordlin as well about the
Yeah, that's right.
about first gospels and the dating of the gospels, which was a real load of fun.
He puts everything really, really early.
Yeah, and I was putting everything very, very late, so we were a good combo and very enjoyable.
He wrote it in 33 AD. No, I'm just kidding.
Fiction mission. Thank you for your super chat. Quick tip: get a job that doesn't rely on religion.
Do you know what? I've been doing quite well out of religion most of my life. Like I've got loads of jobs, but the problem is it's the academic ones that cause me the problems.
Well, thank you for those super chats.
Yeah.
I wish you had
thank you.
received more today, Jacob, but
It happens.
again, Jacob, thank you for doing this because I feel like I'm like fused with Dennis. So when you appreciate his work, it makes me feel good. I've invested so much time and energy. I'm promoting this book, trying to get this out there. It's a game changer. So,
well, I think we can close out now, Derek. I know you need to go. So let's close. And this has been a great discussion. Jack, Dennis, and Derek, thank you all for joining me today. This has been really great. Glad to have gotten the three of you together. Jack, it's the first time you appeared with them together.
Yeah, pleasure. Nice to meet you, Dennis and Derek.
All the best in the future, Jack. Yeah,
Thank you.
of him. Yeah.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.